Well, just as we expected, the quiet revival turned out to be more of a dream than a reality. And even the Christian group that started the hype train about it has retracted the study that launched it. Today, we'll explore that retraction and see why nobody is letting it rain on their revival parade. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today is Tuesday, April 7th, 2026. This is Roll to Disbelieve, and I'm Captain Cassidy. Thank you for joining me. One of the reasons that I really couldn't buy into this whole quiet revival thing was the 414 window. I love this concept. Evangelicals have been thinking about it for decades now. It became ubiquitous around 2010. Basically, it means that if you don't indoctrinate a child between the ages of 4 and 14, they probably won't convert in adulthood. Now, here's the thing. You don't have to indoctrinate them perfectly into whatever you think Christianity should be. No, you just have to get the basic underpinnings of belief into them. The afterlife, fear of hell, a God who sees everything and can do everything but usually doesn't, and especially the idea that the world should be fair and just. Here's the funny part. A while ago, I noticed I really wasn't hearing that much about the 414 window anymore. It's not my imagination either. I went looking, and within the past couple of years, there just hasn't been a lot of buzz about it. I strongly suspect that part of the reason for that lack of buzz is how badly Christian leaders have bombed with Gen Z. Another part of that reason is probably how bad they're gonna bomb with Gen Alpha. 'Cause all of Gen Z is over the age of 14 now. I think they're hitting 15 up. And Gen Alpha, the oldest of them, is coming up on 14, 15 years old. So the window is starting to close again on a new generation. As we will be discussing in much greater detail today, I am not seeing any signs of either Gen Z or Gen Alpha reversing the trend of Christianity's decline. It's just a few pockets here and there. They don't impact the main story of decline. But that truth conflicts with the narrative of the quiet revival, so nobody wants to look at it. Speaking of which, we are going to resume the Alpha Course watch party soon. Please look for the next one on Saturday, April the 18th. So not this Saturday, but next as I'm recording this. It'll start at 6 p.m. Pacific time as per usual. If you're not on the Discord, I've got an invitation in the write-up. Please consider yourself welcome to join us. And before we get going on today's topic, the quiet revival, let me thank my patrons and supporters. For years now, you've made Roll to Disbelieve possible. I couldn't do what I do without you. Thank you. If you'd like to join them, I welcome your support as well. Please check out the links at the end of today's write-up for options. The write-up is either on Patreon at Roll to Disbelieve, one word, or over at our main site, rolltodisbelieve.com. Thank you so much for whatever you decide to do. And now, our situation report. The entire source of the quiet revival retracts their study, and nobody cares. The Bible Society is a UK-based charity. It translates the Bible into local languages around the world and then makes Bibles available to those who can't afford one or find one somewhere. Their work, of course, depends very heavily on donations and volunteer labor. In April 2025, the Bible Society announced that there was a quiet revival happening with Gen Z. Their headline blared, quote, "The Quiet Revival. Gen Z leads rise in church attendance. Church decline in England and Wales has not only stopped, but the church is growing as Gen Z leads an exciting turnaround in church attendance," unquote. Now, we've been talking about the quiet revival off and on since then. Numerous Christians leaped on the idea. They loved it. And as we talked about at the time as well, I had some serious doubts about the validity of the study. Not only did its findings contradict literally every reputable study about Christianity in the West, but they used YouGov, of all things. Well, on March 26th-ish, the Bible Society announced that the whole study was completely flawed. Their CEO, Paul Williams, released a statement that reads in part, quote, "Earlier this month, YouGov informed Bible Society that the 2024 survey sample on which our report, The Quiet Revival, was based was faulty, and it can no longer be regarded as a reliable source of information about the spiritual landscape in Britain." Unquote. So yeah, to their credit, they reported the problem, but it's still funny that their logic still comes down to mistakes were made, not by us. In their original write-up last year, the Bible Society itself did briefly mention some of the possible flaws in their study. They talk about it at the end of the write-up, but they dismissed those concerns immediately. The study's implications were far too glorious to overshadow with petty details. And this report ricocheted all around the world. Religious and secular media outlets alike just jumped on this whole idea. They marveled at all these supposed Gen Z men supposedly flocking to right-wing Christian churches in particular. With the news that their study just wasn't reliable, the Bible Society updated the whole report. They re-released it late last month, and in it they drilled down on the quiet revival concept. They admitted that the YouGov study was faulty, but they still want to have a quiet revival happening. Alas, for these Christians, the quiet revival was so quiet, it completely failed to happen. Oh, and by the way, we are blessed. Squeaky is here. She is curled up and purring like a mad cat next to me. So as it turns out, there is no quiet revival. There never was. But the Bible Society is not letting facts harsh their buzz. The new FAQ they issued contains this very weird statement. Quote, "Unreliable data doesn't mean that there has been no rise in church-going. It means this particular data can't be used to prove it." Oh, and by the way, a quick observation, data doesn't prove anything. It supports, or it fails to support, a hypothesis. Whatever. Moving on. The Quiet Revival surfaced a significant body of corroborating evidence from other surveys, studies, and stories from churches, which we outline in our new report, The Quiet Revival 1 Year On, What's the Story? And which gave us good reason to believe something significant was happening. Unquote. Now, stories? Oh, I can easily believe that. For all too many Christians, the plural of anecdote is anecdata. But what surveys? Which studies? Because nothing reputable that I have ever seen supports, not proves, but supports the notion of any widespread increase in church attendance anywhere in the West. And when it comes to Gen Z, that goes double. Let's have some decline statistics. These are pretty recent ones. In February 2025, Pew Research found out that the decline of Christianity might be stabilizing temporarily. But they cautioned, Gen Z is less religious than older generations overall, with 46% of respondents ages 18 to 24 identifying as Christian versus 80% of ages 74 and up. So that plateau is likely very temporary. They also tell us that between 2007 and 2024, the share of self-professed Christians in America fell from 78% to 62%. In November 2025, Gallup found that the percentage of Americans who say religion is important to them dropped from 66% in 2015 to 49% in 2025. They said this drop was the biggest one they had ever recorded in any country over a 10-year period since 2007. In December 2025, Barna Group, and take them with a grain of salt, but Barna Group found that the percentage of practicing Christians in America fell from 46% in 2000 to 24% in 2025. They don't break the data out by generation or age group, which is really interesting to me. But a 2023 study they ran calls Gen Z the open generation. So they clearly think they've got a chance. By the way, they base this on Gen Z saying that they are open to spiritual type conversations. And they might be. What they're not open to is joining churches. As for the UK, in January 2026, Pew Research offered statistics to support their claim that, quote, Christian identity and practice are not increasing among young adults in Britain, unquote. They found that only 9% of British adults attend church at least once a month, and only 44% of British adults even identify as Christian. The younger the adults, the less likely they are to attend church or profess Christianity in any form. And just as a parting salvo, Pew Research characterized the entire concept of the quiet revival as a Christian revival narrative, and said that it's a narrative that no decent study supports. A report around 2025 from the UK's National Churches Trust paints a very dire picture of both disintegrating church congregations and physically disintegrating churches. In particular, the report says the number of church closures has been rising sharply in Scotland and Wales. Now, they give money to church congregations to preserve their buildings, and without extensive grants to those two countries in particular, that number would likely be even worse. Further, this same group warned in October 2025 that 900 churches think they'll just be closed by 2030. And 2,000 church buildings might get repurposed for secular purposes in 5 years. This is about 5% of the total number of churches in the UK. So the figures don't support any kind of revival, much less a quiet one. But the copium around it, it continues unabated. Nobody cares that the Bible Society retracted the study. They still want the hope. So now we're going to look at sources published after or at least around the time of the retraction. There are a lot of them. On March 26th, Premier Christianity, it's a UK site, evangelical, they asked, now what about the flawed study? In answer, they decide, quote, many other stories and statistics from across the UK suggest we are living in an exciting new era, unquote. Weird, they've been saying that ever since the millennials, huh? Then, on April 1st, they came back with the admonition, quote, not to measure the wrong thing, unquote. Like, don't focus on numbers, because, as they put it, Gen Z are still spiritually hungry, unquote. And again, they're not hungry for church membership. A lot of them seem to be joining because it lets them live out an alt-right aesthetic. And they like that aesthetic, but they don't really seem to care all that much about doing the stuff Jesus told his followers to do. On March 28th, Ross Douthat, I think that's how you say his name, he's a hard-right Catholic convert, and they are weird anyway, but then he got a gig writing opinion pieces for the New York Times, and it sent his weird into overdrive. Well, on March 28th, he declared that Christianity was both reviving and declining. ¿Por qué no los dos? He predicts that his religion might, quote, become more influential on college campuses or in upper-middle-class culture without preventing a continued decline overall, unquote. That doesn't seem to be happening, but whatever, right? On March 30th, Barna Group put out new research claiming that 29% of U.S. adults think that there will be a spiritual revival within 12 months. Gen Z respondents in particular were more likely to think this way. What's funny is their CEO, David Kinnaman, he was very careful about summarizing the study. He was careful to say that the research doesn't predict a revival. Now, it just says that a lot of Americans think there's going to be one. And despite that carefulness, Whoever wrote this thing up for Barna still subtitled that section, "Something is stirring." Okay, picture it didn't happen, baby. Oh, and y'all, definitely recommend checking out the link that I put up for the Barna study. The reasons preferred by different age groups is really interesting. Like Gen Z thought that a revival would happen because of anxiety levels and stuff. But older respondents thought that there would be a revival because younger adults just yearn for Christianity. None of them can agree on why a revival is totally coming, which is a good indication that it isn't. On March 31st, The Atlantic offered us a look at the real religious renewal happening in Gen Z. That one's extra funny because a few years ago they ran a post from Tim Keller that announced American Christianity is due for a revival. Well, actually it wasn't. But in the new piece, their writer, not Tim Keller, he's someone else, he concedes that hard numbers do not support any talk of widespread revival. But he still insists, quote, some young Americans are discovering traditional Christianity anew, unquote. Ooh, but are they though? The latest responses that I could find to the Bible Society's retraction comes to us from David LaRue on April 2nd. He is the CEO of United Christian Broadcasters, so he's not a nobody. In his response, he declared that God's word still stands. And how does he know that there's going to be a revival anyway? Well, he hears anecdata every day at his job. It confirms his beliefs, and so he believes it. Also on April 2nd, David Frost, a conservative politician in the UK, insisted that, quote, Britain is quietly awakening to full-fat supernatural Christianity, unquote. He believes this because he converted to Catholicism and thinks that, quote, footballers are open about their faith in a way that didn't happen a decade back, unquote. Do you see what I mean? They're not talking about actual reliable figures here. They're not talking about anything solid. They're talking about just vibes. The actual reality of Gen Z and revival is so much bleaker than the hopium. As we were talking about much earlier, a long time ago, evangelicals put forth the idea of the 414 window. And again, that term means that if they can't get basic indoctrination into a child between those ages 4 and 14, chances are good that kid will not convert later in life. Without the indoctrinated vulnerabilities to exploit, they don't join. They can't accept the ideas in Christianity. Well, Gen Z's youngest members are now all past the age of 14. That means Christians have already lost that generation. They're gone. The window closed. Anyone who isn't already basically indoctrinated probably never will be. Indeed, in 2022, 4 years ago, the Survey Center on American Life published a study that said that 34% of Gen Z were unaffiliated with any religion. That is more people unaffiliated than any other generation they studied before. As for the 414 window, Gen Alpha is now very comfortably between the time window. They're about 4 to 14 years old now. But they aren't terribly religious either. In fact, they seem a lot less religious than Gen Z. A springtime study published last year, January 2025, indicates that only 19% of 13-year-olds who were Alpha's oldest kids at the time, only 19% of them considered themselves very spiritual. For that matter, only 66% of those Alpha 13-year-olds considered themselves Christian, and only about 30% of those 13-year-olds attended church at least weekly, with 42% saying they never or rarely attended. That's a really important figure, because that Survey Center on American Life study we talked about just a second ago, they said 40% of Gen Z were claiming weekly attendance. Well, Alpha is saying that only 30% of them do. That's a drop from 40% to 30%. Here's where it stands. None of the anecdata that I've heard has translated into churches gaining any substantial number of new members or even of a substantial raising of the average age of the congregation of these churches. There's gonna be blips in the data when it comes to humans and behavior. Like there's gonna be really charismatic pastors that grow churches like, whoa. There's gonna be churches that have heavy funding to start with, which is a very solid predictor of growth. Those blips, they're gonna happen all across the data, all across the board. What our sources are talking about to justify their belief in the quiet revival are exactly those kinds of blips. They cite things like Bible sales or Alpha Course signups. And that's fine, whatever. The overall trend is what we're going to watch. We want to see if the blips translate into an actual reversal of decline. The trend line just doesn't take us to the quiet revival. In fact, it takes us to an implosion coming churches' way, and it's one that they are not ready for at all. In August 2025, there was a landmark study in Nature. It focused on 3 aspects of religious affiliation: participation, importance, and belonging. Of course, participation is stuff like praying and notably going to church. Importance is the feeling that religion is really important to your daily life, and belonging is the sense of having that label of Christian. What they found is that as countries secularize, participation begins to wane. The feeling of religion as important fades as well, and then even the sense of belonging to that religion goes away. It's not a hard and fast pattern, of course. Sometimes a country that's secularizing will start to tie really fervent participation to its own kind of nationalism. So it'll kind of buck the trend a little bit here and there. But as I said, trend lines are what we watch. As countries secularize, PIB tends to hold true. And here's where that matters with the whole quiet revival. The quiet revival is basically about Gen Z flooding into churches. But the PIB model holds that younger folks tend to be far less religious than older ones. I've never seen a reputable study saying otherwise either. Once the younger people start drifting away from a religion, it's done. There isn't a way to get them back. There most especially isn't a way to recapture the next generation. And here is where it gets even worse for Christians. Once those younger unaffiliated folks grow up and start having kids of their own, they are very unlikely to get them indoctrinated. The 414 window, they'll pass right through it. What we're describing here is a doom spiral. There's not a way to reverse it. And that is a serious problem for American churches. Because right now, elderly folks form the backbone of countless church congregations in America. Those folks are going to start dying in earnest soon. There's going to be a lot of them dying. And as Ryan Burge has said, American churches ain't ready for that. It's going to be an implosion. And so far, Christian leaders haven't been able to come up with a single workable strategy to reverse the disaffiliation trends in young adults. They need young blood in their churches, but young blood has proven very difficult to acquire. All church leaders have left is hoping against hope that Gen Z or even Alpha suddenly just gets a wild hair up its ass about religion and starts joining in massive enough numbers to offset the die-off that is coming churches' way. That is where the narrative of the quiet revival finds its strongest legs. And that's where it falls down the hardest. 'Cause who are Christians gonna believe? Their leaders or their own lying eyes? As long as the answer is, you don't have to change because young adults are flooding in anyway, they're not going to change. And that is good news for the rest of us that we can carry forward in a week where there's so much bad news going on. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. Next up, nobody in evangelicalism seems to understand church growth. So we are going to be super helpful to these guys next time and show them why churches grow or fade. Spoiler, it has nothing to do with doctrines or Jesus. Whoops. Until then, this is Captain Cassidy signing off. I hope you all have a great midweek, and we'll see you soon.